When 32-year-old single mother Leah Jenkins started tearing up her front yard in late October, dragging massive ugly black pipes into deep trenches, her Oak Creek neighbors treated her like a circus act. They filmed her from their perfectly manicured lawns, laughed at her expense, and even called the city inspector to have her fined. Nobody in the affluent Michigan suburb thought they'd actually be fighting for their lives against the killer winter predicted for 2023. But 3 months later, when a historic blizzard obliterated the power grid and temperatures plummeted to a lethal -30 degrees, the laughter stopped. As their luxury homes transformed into frozen tombs, Leah's modest house remained a comfortable 50 degrees warmer, and the very people who had mocked her were about to come begging at her door. The biting wind of late October swept through Oak Creek, carrying with it the unmistakable scent of an early, brutal winter. For most residents in this upscale Michigan suburb, the changing season meant swapping out their luxury SUVs' tires and scheduling their automatic heating oil deliveries. For Leah Jenkins, it meant sheer panic. Leah had bought the small, aging ranch house at the end of Maple Drive 3 years ago, right before her husband packed his bags and decided he wanted a new life on the West Coast, leaving her with a mortgage she could barely afford, and a 6-year-old son, Leo, who had chronic asthma. The house was a fixer-upper that never got fixed. Its insulation was practically non-existent, and the ancient oil furnace in the basement was a ravenous beast that devoured fuel. The previous winter, Leah had gone into credit card debt just to keep the thermostat at 60 degrees. This year, the Farmer's Almanac and local meteorologists were all predicting a polar vortex anomaly, a winter so severe it hadn't been seen in the Great Lakes region for over 50 years. Heating oil prices had skyrocketed, and Leah's bank account had exactly $412 left in it. She couldn't afford to run the furnace. She couldn't afford to move. And she couldn't let Leo freeze. Desperation breeds ingenuity, but in Leah's case, it resurrected a memory. Her late grandfather, Arthur, had been an eccentric structural engineer who swore by off-grid living and passive heating. He used to draw diagrams on diner napkins showing her how the Earth just a few feet below the frost line maintained a constant stable temperature of around 50 to 55 degrees Fahrenheit, regardless of the blizzards raging above. Earth-coupled heat exchange, he had called it. Leah spent 4 sleepless nights at her kitchen table, illuminated by a single lamp poring over old textbooks, engineering forums, and YouTube tutorials. If she buried enough corrugated tubing deep enough in her yard, pulling fresh air through the pipes and into her house, the Earth would naturally warm the freezing outside air before it reached her living room. It wouldn't make the house a tropical paradise, but it would keep it above freezing. It would keep them alive. The problem was the execution. On a crisp Tuesday morning, Leah rented a heavy-duty mechanical trencher from the local hardware store. It drained half of her remaining funds. When the loud diesel-chugging machine rolled off the flatbed trailer onto her overgrown lawn, the noise immediately drew the attention of Tom Garrison. Tom lived directly across the street in a towering, custom-built modern craftsman. He was the kind of man who measured his self-worth by the greenness of his lawn and the strict adherence to the unwritten neighborhood aesthetic. He was also the self-appointed king of Maple Drive. "What in the world are you doing, Leah?" Tom called out, jogging across the asphalt, his hands tucked into an expensive Patagonia vest. He eyed the heavy machinery with outright disgust. "Landscaping," Leah said shortly, wrestling with the trencher's heavy iron handles. She didn't have the energy or the time to explain thermodynamics to a man who complained when her trash cans were left out an hour past collection time. "Landscaping. It's practically November. The ground is going to freeze in 2 weeks," Tom said, a condescending smirk playing on his lips. "And what are those?" He pointed to the driveway where a delivery truck had just dumped 4 massive coiled bundles of black corrugated ADS drainage pipes, each 100 feet long and 6 inches in diameter. "French drains," Leah lied smoothly, though her heart pounded. "I had some basement flooding last spring." Tom scoffed, shaking his head. "Well, it looks like a junkyard." Try to wrap this up before the weekend, all right. The Miller family is hosting a dinner party and nobody wants to look at an industrial work zone. Leah ignored him firing up the trencher. The machine roared to life, biting into the thick turf and throwing a rooster tail of dark Michigan soil into the air. By day 3, the neighborhood's mild annoyance had turned into a spectator sport. Leah's yard looked like a World War I battlefield. Deep 4-foot trenches zigzagged across her front lawn in a massive serpentine pattern. Her hands were blistered and bleeding, wrapped in duct tape where her work gloves had worn through. Her back screamed in agony every time she bent over to haul the heavy dirt. Brenda Miller. The neighborhood gossip began posting photos of Leah's yard on the Oak Creek Community Facebook page. Has anyone checked on the Jenkins woman? Brenda wrote. She's out there at 6 a.m. digging trenches like a lunatic, putting massive black pipes in the ground. Honestly, it's tanking our property values. The comments poured in. They called her crazy. They joked that she was building a doomsday bunker. Whenever Leah was out in the yard, cars would slow down as they drove past the occupants, rolling down their windows to point and laugh. "Hey, Leah!" a teenager yelled from a passing Jeep. "The zombies aren't coming yet." Leah bit her lip, tasting copper. Her muscles trembled with exhaustion. She watched her son Leo looking out the living room window. He had his inhaler in one hand, pressing his small face against the cold glass. She waved at him, forcing a bright, reassuring smile. She didn't care if she was the neighborhood joke. She was digging for their survival. The hardest part wasn't the digging. It was the depth. To make the earth tube system work, the pipes had to be buried below the frost line, which in Michigan meant digging down at least 4 feet. At that depth, the Earth's temperature remains a constant 50 to 55 degrees, acting as a natural radiator. Cold winter air drawn into one end of the pipe would travel through the underground labyrinth, slowly warming up before it was expelled into the house. Leah had to lay over 300 feet of pipe in a continuous loop to ensure the air had enough time to absorb the Earth's heat. She lined the bottom of the trenches with a thin layer of gravel for drainage, carefully sloping the pipes so that any condensation would pool away from the house. It was grueling, backbreaking work. Every shovelful of heavy clay-rich soil felt like lifting lead. The physical toll was immense. She lost 5 pounds in a week. Her fingernails were perpetually caked in black dirt, and a permanent ache settled deep into her bones. On Friday afternoon, just as she was connecting the final segment of the intake pipe near the edge of her property, a white Ford F-150 with the city seal emblazoned on the door pulled up to her curb. Leah's stomach dropped. A tall, stern-looking man in a high-visibility jacket stepped out clutching a clipboard. He adjusted his hard hat and walked over, carefully avoiding the mounds of loose dirt. "Leah Jenkins?" he asked. "Yes," Leah replied, leaning on her shovel, trying to hide her trembling hands. "I'm Daniel Caldwell, City Code Enforcement," he said, handing her a business card. "We received multiple complaints from a Mr. Garrison regarding unpermitted excavation and potential utility line disruption at this address." Tom. Of course it was Tom. Leah looked across the street and saw Tom standing on his porch, holding a mug of coffee, watching the scene with profound satisfaction. I called the utility companies before I started digging," Leah said defensively. "Miss Digg marked all the gas and water lines. I haven't touched them. I'm completely clear." Daniel looked at the massive serpentine trenches and the black pipes winding through them. "Ma'am, this is a significant alteration. What exactly are you building? If this is a septic leach field, you are in serious violation of city ordinances." "It's not septic," Leah said quickly. Her mind raced. If he hit her with a stop work order, she was doomed. Winter was days away. If she had to leave the trenches open, they would freeze and the whole system would be ruined. "It's a passive drainage aeration system. My basement floods. I'm laying these perforated pipes to draw moisture away from the foundation and vent it out here." It was a half-truth, wrapped in technical jargon, relying heavily on the fact that the corrugated pipes looked exactly like standard French drain materials. Daniel frowned, walking the length of the trench. He peered down at the slope. He checked the intake vent, a screened PVC pipe sticking out of the ground near a large oak tree. "Aeration?" Daniel asked skeptically. And where does it connect to the house? Right there through the old dryer vent hole in the foundation. Leah pointed to a sealed junction near her basement window. Daniel sighed, scratching his chin. The city code was notoriously vague about drainage systems on private property, provided they didn't dump water onto a neighbor's lot. "It's an eyesore, Ms. Jenkins," Daniel said finally, clicking his pen. "And your neighbors are very unhappy." "Is there a code against ugly yards, Mr. Caldwell?" Leah asked quietly, her voice trembling just a fraction. "Because I have a son with severe asthma, and I'm doing what I have to do to fix my home before the snow flies. I'm filling the dirt back in tomorrow. By Monday, you won't even know it's here." Daniel looked at her exhausted, dirt-streaked face. He looked at her blistered hands. Then he looked across the street at Tom Garrison, who was still smirking on his porch. "You have until Monday at 5 p.m. to backfill these trenches and level the grade." Daniel said, his tone softening just a fraction. "If I drive by on Tuesday and see a hazard, I'm issuing a citation. Make sure the intake has a critter screen. You don't want raccoons in your basement." "Thank you." Leah breathed relief washing over her like a tidal wave. "Thank you so much." Over the next 48 hours, Leah worked like a woman possessed. She couldn't afford to rent the trencher for the backfilling, so she did it by hand. Shovelful by shovelful, she buried her lifeline. She worked through the night under the glow of a halogen work light. By Sunday evening, her yard was a flat expanse of scarred, overturned dirt. Inside the basement, she finalized the connections. The cold air returned from the buried pipes, fed directly into a heavily insulated wooden box she had built herself. Inside the box sat a low-wattage, high-efficiency inline duct fan powered by a salvaged 12-volt car battery connected to a single small solar panel she had mounted on her roof. When she finally flipped the switch, the fan hummed to life. She placed her hand over the duct leading up to the living room floor registers. A gentle, steady breeze blew against her palm. It wasn't hot. It wasn't like the blast of a gas furnace. But the air entering the intake pipe outside was a bitter 35 degrees. The air blowing onto her hand was 52 degrees. 17 degrees of free heat pulled directly from the earth. Leah slumped against the basement wall and wept. It worked. November passed with a creeping chill, and by the first week of December, the warnings began to broadcast across every radio and television station. The meteorologists stopped using the word anomaly and started using words like catastrophic and historic. A massive low-pressure system dropping down from Canada was colliding with heavy moisture from the lakes. They called it a bomb cyclone. The residents of Oak Creek swarmed the grocery stores, clearing out bread, milk, and bottled water. Delivery trucks worked overtime, filling the massive heating oil tanks of the sprawling suburban homes. Tom Garrison stopped Leah as she was walking back from the mailbox 2 days before the storm hit. The temperature was already dropping rapidly, hovering around 20 degrees. "Hope your little mud pie project is keeping you warm, Leah," Tom sneered, zipping up his heavy parka. "The news says we might see -20 by Thursday. If your pipes freeze and burst under there, I'm calling the HOA." "My pipes are fine, Tom," Leah said evenly, clutching her thin coat around her. "Make sure your generator's fueled up." "I don't need a generator," Tom laughed confidently. "I have 500 gallons of oil in my tank and a brand new smart thermostat. I'll be sitting in my living room in shorts. Try not to freeze to death." The storm hit on a Wednesday afternoon, and it didn't just arrive. It slammed into the state like a physical blow. The sky turned a bruised, violent purple before unleashing a blinding wall of white. The wind howled at 60 miles per hour, tearing shingles from roofs and ripping heavy branches from the ancient oak trees that lined the streets. By nightfall, the snow was falling at a rate of 3 inches an hour. Inside her small house, Leah and Leo huddled in the living room. Leah had spent the previous weekend sealing every drafty window with heavy plastic sheeting and thick duct tape. She hung heavy wool blankets over the doors. The house was essentially a sealed envelope. Down in the basement, the little inline fan hummed steadily, drawing air from the deep earth. At 9:15 p.m., a massive, sickening crack echoed through the neighborhood, followed by the blinding blue flash of a transformer blowing out a few blocks away. Instantly, Maple Drive plunged into absolute darkness. The power grid had failed. Leah struck a match and lit a kerosene lantern she had placed on the coffee table. The warm yellow light danced across the room. Leo, wrapped in a thick sleeping bag, looked up at her with wide, frightened eyes. "Mom, did the heater break?" he asked, his voice trembling. "No, baby," Leah said, pulling him close. "The electricity outside is broken, but our system doesn't need their electricity. We're going to be okay." Outside, the temperature began its deadly free fall. By midnight, it was 10 degrees below zero. The wind chill made it feel like -30. Without electricity, the giant modern oil furnaces in the surrounding mansions were useless. A furnace needs electricity to run the blower motors and the electronic ignition. The smart thermostats went blank. Across the street, Tom Garrison woke up shivering. He grabbed his phone and turned on the flashlight. The air in his bedroom was freezing. He ran downstairs, his breath pluming in white clouds in the beam of his phone. He frantically pushed the buttons on his thermostat. Nothing. "Damn it!" Tom yelled, kicking the wall. He grabbed blankets, piling them onto his bed. But his house, with its massive cathedral ceilings and walls of decorative glass windows, was bleeding heat at a catastrophic rate. By 4 a.m., the temperature inside his house was 38 degrees and dropping. Next door, Brenda Miller was in full panic mode. She had tried calling the utility company, but the lines were jammed. She tried to light a fire in her decorative gas fireplace, but it required an electronic valve to open. She and her husband huddled in their closet wearing their winter coats, terrified. As dawn broke on Thursday, the storm showed no signs of stopping. The snowdrifts outside were 5 feet high, burying cars and blocking the roads completely. No plows were coming. No utility trucks could get through. The entire town was isolated, trapped in a deep freeze. Leah woke up and checked the thermometer she had mounted on the living room wall. It read 54 degrees. It wasn't toasty. She was wearing a thick sweater and thermal leggings, but it was survivable. It was profoundly, miraculously safe. Outside, the ambient air temperature was a lethal -22 degrees. The earth tubes buried in her yard were pulling in that deadly air, passing it through 300 feet of 52-degree soil and delivering it into her home at a steady, life-saving temperature. Her house was nearly 80 degrees warmer than the frozen hellscape outside. She made her way to the kitchen using a small propane camping stove to boil water for oatmeal. As she poured the hot water, she glanced out the kitchen window, wiping away the condensation. Through the howling whiteout conditions, she saw a figure struggling through the waist-deep snow across the street. It was a man wrapped in what looked like a comforter, stumbling blindly toward her front door. It was Tom Garrison, and he wasn't laughing anymore. The pounding on the front door was weak, barely audible over the shrieking wind that battered the siding of Leah's house. If she hadn't been standing in the kitchen staring out through the small patch of defrosted glass, she might have missed it entirely. Leah hesitated. She looked back at the living room, where little Leo was coloring in a book still tucked inside his heavy sleeping bag. The temperature gauge on the wall held remarkably steady at 53 degrees. Outside, it was a lethal, unforgiving -22, with wind chills plunging past -40. Opening the door meant letting that deathly grip into her sanctuary. The pounding came again, followed by a muffled, desperate shout. Leah hurried to the entryway, pulling the heavy wool blanket aside. She unfastened the deadbolt and yanked the door open just a few inches. The wind instantly screamed through the crack, tearing at her hair and biting her skin like thousands of icy needles. Tom Garrison practically collapsed against the doorframe. The self-appointed king of Maple Drive was unrecognizable. He wasn't wearing his designer vest or his confident smirk. He was wrapped tightly in a thick floral-patterned down comforter, his face pale and tinged with a terrifying waxy blue. His eyebrows and eyelashes were thick with white frost, and his teeth chattered so violently they sounded like cracking glass. "Leah!" Tom gasped, his voice thin and ragged, stripped of all its usual authority. "Please, my house, it's a freezer. It's 30 degrees in my bedroom. The pipes burst in the master bath. It's all ice. Please!" Leah stared at him. This was the man who had called the city inspector on her, the man who had organized the neighborhood mockery, laughing from his porch while she broke her back in the freezing mud. A dark, bitter part of her wanted to close the door. She wanted to tell him to go sit in his imported leather armchair and wait for his smart thermostat to magically turn back on. But she looked at his hands clutching the comforter. They were bare, violently shaking, and his knuckles were turning a dangerous shade of purple. He was experiencing the early stages of hypothermia. If she turned him away, he would die on his walk back across the street. "Get in," Leah commanded, pulling the door open just enough for him to squeeze through. Tom stumbled inside, and Leah immediately threw her weight against the door, slamming it shut against the howling gale and re-securing the heavy wool blanket over the frame. The sudden silence in the entryway was deafening, broken only by Tom's ragged breathing and the steady, quiet hum of the inline fan in the basement. Tom dropped the snow-covered comforter onto the floor, shivering uncontrollably. He looked around the dimly lit house. The windows were sealed in thick plastic sheeting. The furniture was pushed into a tight circle in the center of the room to conserve body heat. It looked like a survival bunker. And it was warm. It wasn't a tropical paradise, but compared to the brutal reality he had just escaped, the 53-degree air felt like a blazing fire. Tom sank against the wall, sliding down until he was sitting on the floor, burying his face in his hands. A sharp, embarrassing sob racked his chest. "I'm sorry." He wept the frozen tears melting on his cheeks. "I was so wrong. I was so damn arrogant, Leah. I thought my money made me safe." Leah stood over him, holding a thermos of the hot water she had just boiled on her camp stove. She poured a measure into a ceramic mug, dropping a green tea bag into it, and handed it down to him. "Drink it slowly," she said, her voice completely devoid of the deferential tone she used to use with him. The dynamic had shifted entirely. She wasn't the struggling, mocked single mother anymore. She was the captain of the only life raft in a frozen ocean. "Wrap your hands around the mug. Don't rub them together, you'll damage the tissue if you have frost nip." Tom took the mug with shaking hands, nodding obediently. "How?" he whispered, looking up at the ceiling, then down at the floor vents. "There's no power. You don't have a generator. I don't smell wood smoke. How is it this warm in here?" "Earth-coupled heat exchange," Leah replied, simply crossing her arms. "The Mud Pie Project. The trenches you tried to get me fined for. I buried 300 feet of corrugated pipe 4 feet underground. The earth down there is 52 degrees. I'm pulling outside air through those pipes, letting the earth warm it, and blowing it into the house using a salvaged car battery and a 12-volt fan." Tom stared at her, his jaw slack. The sheer brilliant simplicity of it, combined with the grueling physical labor it required, left him entirely speechless. He had spent $50,000 on a state-of-the-art HVAC system that was currently a useless heap of metal, because it relied entirely on a fragile centralized power grid. Leah had spent $400 in the skin on her hands to harness the permanent, unbreakable heat of the planet itself. "I mocked you," Tom said, his voice laced with shame. "Yes, you did," Leah agreed softly. "But right now, survival is more important than my pride or your ego. You can stay on the couch, keep the blankets wrapped around you, and Tom, if you complain about the tea, you're going back out into the snow." Tom managed a weak, self-deprecating smile. "Yes, ma'am." By Friday morning, day 2 of the blackout, the storm had escalated from a blizzard into a meteorological nightmare. The snow was falling horizontally, driven by merciless, unrelenting winds. The massive snowdrifts had swallowed cars whole, turning the suburban streets of Oak Creek into a terrifying white desert. Inside Leah's house, the temperature had dipped slightly to 51 degrees, a consequence of the extreme surface cold seeping through her aging walls despite the plastic sheeting. But the basement fan continued its tireless, quiet hum, faithfully drawing warmth from the deep earth. Leah was rationing food. She had a decent stockpile of dry goods, oatmeal, rice beans, and canned soup, but she had planned for 2 people, not 3. Tom had proven surprisingly cooperative, keeping quietly to himself, entertaining Leo by making shadow puppets on the wall with the beam of his dying flashlight. Around 10 a.m., Leah heard a frantic scratching at the front door. Not a knock, a scratch. She hurried to the entryway, pulling back the blanket. When she opened the door, a heavy mass of snow fell inward, followed by two figures collapsing onto her threshold. It was Brenda Miller and her husband, Mark. They were in catastrophic shape. Brenda's face was smeared with frozen mascara and tears, her lips a shocking, dangerous blue. Mark was practically carrying her. He looked up at Leah with wild, desperate eyes. "Leah, please," Mark begged, his voice cracking. "Brenda is unresponsive. Our house, it's 18 degrees inside. Everything is frozen solid. I saw your roof." Leah frowned, helping Mark drag Brenda inside. Tom rushed over to assist, throwing his own warm blankets over the shivering woman. "My roof?" Leah asked. "The snow is melting around the vent near your chimney," Mark gasped, falling to his knees on her entryway rug. "Everyone else's house is a solid block of ice, but your house, it's breathing. Please tell me you have heat." Wordlessly, Leah pointed to the thermometer on the wall. Mark stared at the little red line resting just above the 50-degree mark, and he burst into tears. "Close the door," Leah ordered Tom. "Get Brenda onto the floor near the vent. Strip off her wet outer layers. Fast." For the next hour, Leah's living room became a triage center. Brenda was dangerously close to severe hypothermia. They layered her in dry blankets, and Leah placed bottles filled with warm water heated over the propane stove into Brenda's armpits and groin to raise her core temperature slowly. As Brenda's color began to return, a harsh reality settled over Leah. She looked around her small living room. There were now 5 people in a house meant for 2, and the storm wasn't breaking. "Listen to me," Leah said, standing in the center of the room. She commanded the attention of the 3 adults who had just weeks ago treated her like a neighborhood nuisance. "You are welcome to stay here. But this is not a hotel, and I am not your maid. We are surviving on a very delicate system." Mark and Tom nodded vigorously. Brenda, still weak, managed a slow, grateful nod. "We have 2 major rules," Leah continued, pointing to the kitchen. "Rule 1. We do not open the front door unless it is absolute life or death. Every time that door opens, we lose 20 minutes of earth heat. Rule 2. The food is rationed. We have beans, rice, and oatmeal. Nobody complains. Nobody asks for seconds. Does everyone understand?" "We understand, Leah," Mark said fervently. "We owe you our lives. Whatever you say goes." But the peace of Camp Jenkins was shattered just 3 hours later. A loud, aggressive pounding echoed from the front door. Leah sighed, exhausted, and moved to answer it. When she pulled the door open, she was met with a furious, towering man. It was Greg Walsh, the neighborhood association president. He lived 3 houses down. He was bundled in heavy hunting gear, holding a heavy metal crowbar. "Greg," Leah asked, alarmed by the weapon. "I want the battery," Greg demanded, his voice aggressive, his eyes darting past her to the warm interior of the house. "I know you've got some kind of power in there. I can hear the hum from your basement vent outside. My wife is freezing to death. I am taking your battery to run the inverter on my truck so I can power my space heaters." "No," Leah said flatly, stepping into the doorway to block his view. "The battery runs a fan that pulls air through a geothermal loop. It's what is keeping this house alive. A space heater will drain it in 20 minutes. If you take my battery, my system dies, and everyone in this house freezes." "I don't give a damn about your mud pipes," Greg roared, stepping forward, raising the crowbar slightly. "My wife is freezing. Hand it over, Leah. You're a single mom. Don't make me push past you." Before Leah could react, a shadow moved behind her. Tom Garrison stepped into the doorway, standing shoulder to shoulder with Leah. He had shed his blankets and was holding the heavy iron fire poker Leah used for her currently inactive fireplace. Tom wasn't a large man, but the look in his eyes was something cold and feral, the look of a man who had stared death in the face and wasn't going back. "Take a walk, Greg," Tom said, his voice dangerously low. Greg blinked, shocked. "Tom, what the hell are you doing in there? She's hoarding power." "She's keeping us alive, you arrogant prick," Tom shot back. She offered you the same grace, but you came with a weapon. You touch her, you touch that battery, and I swear to God I will break your arm. You want to save Nancy, bring her here. Humble yourself, but you are not touching Leah's equipment. Mark Miller stepped up behind Tom, holding a heavy cast-iron skillet from Leah's kitchen. He's right, Greg. Back off. Greg looked at the three of them, a united, desperate front. He lowered the crowbar, his bravado breaking under the weight of his own freezing reality. He looked at the warm amber light spilling from Leah's house, then back out at the blinding, deadly whiteout behind him. "I'll go get Nancy," Greg muttered, turning away in defeat. Leah closed the door, her hands shaking slightly. She looked at Tom and Mark. "Thank you." "Don't thank us," Tom said, setting the fire poker down. "You built the ark, Leah. We're just making sure nobody sinks it." By day 3, the silence outside had grown deafening. The wind had finally stopped howling, but the cessation of noise only amplified the horrific reality of their situation. The snow had stopped falling, leaving behind drifts that reached the second-story windows of some houses. The temperature had plummeted even further in the clear, still air, hitting a record-shattering -32 degrees. Inside Leah's living room, the situation was tense. There were now 7 people living in the tight space: Leah, Leo, Tom, Brenda, Mark, Greg, and Nancy. The air felt heavy and stale. The temperature gauge had finally cracked, dropping to 48 degrees. It was cold enough that everyone was wearing their winter coats indoors, their breath occasionally pluming in the dim light. But 48 degrees was survivable. It was a miracle. However, the psychological toll of being trapped in the dark, cramped space was beginning to show. The smell of unwashed bodies, the lingering odor of the camp stove, and the sheer terror of the unknown were fraying nerves. Nancy Walsh, who had arrived the previous evening nearly catatonic with cold, sat wrapped in a corner rocking back and forth. Greg paced the small hallway, muttering to himself. "We can't just sit here," Greg snapped, running a hand through his greasy hair. "The food is going to run out. The propane for your little stove is going to run out. We need to dig our way to the highway." "The snow is 6 feet deep, Greg," Mark replied wearily, rubbing his temples. "We don't have the calories to shovel our way out of this neighborhood. We'd freeze before we made it half a mile." "We can't just wait to die," Greg yelled, his panic boiling over. "Nobody is dying!" Leah snapped, her voice cutting through the rising hysteria like a whip. She stood up from the floor where she was playing a board game with Leo. "The system is holding. The battery is charging enough during the day from the solar panel to run the fan at night. We have enough rice and beans for another week if we ration heavily. We stay put." Suddenly, the quiet, steady hum vibrating through the floorboards stuttered. Everyone froze. The sound was so subtle they had almost tuned it out over the last 3 days, but its sudden absence was like a physical blow. The inline fan in the basement wheezed, whined, and then spun down to absolute silence. Panic erupted instantly. "What happened?" Brenda shrieked. "Did the battery die? Did you break it, Greg?" Tom demanded, standing up abruptly. "I didn't touch anything," Greg shouted defensively. Leah grabbed her flashlight and sprinted for the basement door. Tom was right on her heels. They rushed down the wooden stairs into the pitch-black cellar. The air down here was significantly colder. Leah pointed her flashlight at the insulated box housing the fan. The battery indicator light was still glowing a healthy green. She checked the wires. Everything was connected. "The power source is fine," Leah muttered, her heart hammering against her ribs. She pressed her hand against the intake duct coming from the wall. Usually there was a steady pressure of 52-degree air pushing against the metal. Now there was nothing. A dead, still vacuum. "The fan is trying to pull, but it's choked." Leah realized, her blood running cold. She looked at Tom, her eyes wide with terror. "The intake pipe outside. The wind must have shifted the snowdrifts during the night. The external vent is buried. The system is suffocating." "How long do we have?" Tom asked, his breath misting heavily in the basement air. If we don't get new air moving through those underground pipes, the static air inside them will equalize with the frozen ground closer to the surface," Leah explained rapidly. "The heat bank will deplete. The house will drop to freezing in less than 2 hours. We have to clear that vent. They ran back upstairs. The intake is blocked, Leah announced to the terrified group. I need to go outside and dig it out. Are you crazy? Mark said, his eyes wide. It's -32 out there. You step outside, your lungs will start to freeze in minutes. If I don't, we all freeze anyway, Leah said, moving to the coat closet. She started pulling on every layer she could find: 2 sweaters, a heavy parka, 2 pairs of sweatpants, snow pants. Mommy? Leo whimpered from his sleeping bag, his bottom lip trembling. Don't go out there. The monster is out there. Leah paused, looking at her son. Her heart shattered. If she went out there and got disoriented in the massive drifts, or if the cold locked her muscles before she could dig through 6 feet of packed snow, she would die in her own front yard. Leah would be left an orphan in a freezing house with strangers. Suddenly, a heavy hand clamped onto her shoulder. Tom was standing beside her. He had already pulled on his heavy boots and was wrapping a wool scarf tightly around his face, leaving only a tiny slit for his eyes. He held a heavy aluminum snow shovel in his gloved hands. You're not going, Tom said, his voice muffled by the thick wool. Tom, you don't know exactly where the vent is. I know exactly where it is, Tom interrupted, looking her dead in the eye. It's right next to the old oak tree. I know because I stood on my porch and took pictures of it to send to the city inspector to get you fined. A heavy, poignant silence filled the room. I mocked you for building this, Leah, Tom said, his voice thick with emotion. I tried to tear it down. The least I can do is keep it running. Take care of Leo. Before Leah could argue, Tom moved to the front door. He pulled the blanket aside, unlocked the deadbolt, and pushed. The door barely moved. A wall of packed snow blocked the exit. Tom stepped back and rammed his shoulder into the wood, forcing the door open against the drift. He stepped out into the blinding crystalline white void, and the door slammed shut behind him. Inside, Leah pressed her face against the small patch of clear glass in the living room window. She could barely see him. Tom was a dark silhouette, fighting through snow that was chest high. Every movement looked agonizingly slow, like he was moving through thick mud. 5 minutes passed, then 10. He's been out there too long, Greg whispered, staring over Leah's shoulder. At that temperature, frostbite sets in on exposed skin in less than 5 minutes. Through the glass, Leah saw Tom reach the area near the oak tree. He began to dig furiously, throwing massive shovelfuls of snow blindly into the air. He was digging downward, practically disappearing into a crater of his own making. 15 minutes. Suddenly, a massive shudder ran through the floorboards. From the basement, a sound echoed through the house. It started as a low, struggling whine, and then slowly, beautifully, it smoothed out into a steady, powerful hum. The fan was breathing again. A cheer erupted in the living room. Mark hugged Brenda. Greg fell to his knees. Leah didn't cheer. She kept her eyes locked on the window. The hum meant the vent was clear. But Tom hadn't emerged from the crater. Tom! Leah screamed, tearing away from the window and sprinting for the front door. She threw open the locks, pushed past the heavy snow blocking the frame, and plunged into the deadly freezing void to bring the king of Maple Drive back home. The second Leah stepped past the threshold, the wind tore the breath violently from her lungs. It wasn't just cold. It was an aggressive physical assault. At -32 degrees, the air felt thick, composed of microscopic shards of glass that shredded the inside of her throat with every desperate gasp. Her eyelashes froze together instantly, the moisture from her eyes crystallizing before tears could even form. "Tom!" she screamed, but the sound was swallowed instantly by the sheer terrifying emptiness of the whiteout. The neighborhood of Oak Creek was gone. The mansions, the streetlights, the manicured lawns, everything had been erased, replaced by a lunar landscape of shifting mountainous snowdrifts. She waded into the trench Tom had carved with his body and the shovel. The snow was packed so tightly by the wind that it felt like moving through wet concrete. Every step required monumental effort. Her heavy winter boots sank deep, and the snow rushed in over the tops, instantly biting at her calves. 50 feet, she told herself. The oak tree is only 50 feet away. She pushed forward, her arms swimming through the powder. The silence out here was maddening. Inside the house there had been the hum of the fan, the breathing of the survivors, the creak of the floorboards. Out here there was only the high-pitched whistle of the wind skimming over the top of the drifts. At 30 feet, she stumbled. Her knee hit something hard and metallic hidden beneath the snow. She dug frantically with her heavy mittens. It was the aluminum snow shovel. The thick, reinforced handle was snapped cleanly in half. Panic surged through her veins, a hot shot of adrenaline that temporarily pushed back the numbing cold. If the shovel broke, how did he clear the vent? Tom, she shrieked again, her voice cracking. She scrambled forward on her hands and knees, practically swimming over the snowpack until she reached the massive dark trunk of the old oak tree. The snow here was churned and chaotic, a massive crater dug out from the flat surface. She slid down into the crater. At the bottom, partially buried by the constantly shifting snow, was the 6-inch PVC intake pipe of her geothermal system. The protective wire mesh she had clamped over it was clear. The air was audibly rushing into it, a steady, life-saving suction. But right beside it, curled into a tight, agonizing fetal position, was Tom Garrison. He was entirely covered in white, looking more like a snowdrift than a human being. He had taken off his thick winter gloves. They were lying next to the vent, frozen solid. He had used his bare hands to claw away the final layers of ice and packed snow from the mesh screen after the shovel broke. Worse, he had positioned his body directly over the hole, like a human shield blocking the wind from blowing new snow back into the intake while the fan sucked the air down. He had literally offered himself up to the elements to keep her system breathing. Leah fell to her knees beside him. Tom, look at me." She grabbed his shoulders and rolled him onto his back. His face was a horrifying, waxy shade of gray. His lips were entirely blue, pulling back from his teeth in a rictus of agonizing cold. His eyes were closed, and his bare hands were curled into rigid, immovable claws, the skin a terrifying deep violet. He wasn't shivering anymore. That was the most dangerous sign. His core temperature had dropped so low that his body had abandoned its primary defense mechanism. No, Leah sobbed, slapping his frozen cheek. It felt like striking marble. "You don't get to die on my lawn, Tom Garrison, wake up." He didn't move. Leah grabbed him by the collar of his heavy parka. She was a small woman, exhausted from days of rationing food and terror. But the maternal primal instinct to save the man who had just saved her son gave her a burst of superhuman strength. She dragged him upward, pulling his dead weight out of the crater. The journey back to the house was a blur of agonizing pain. Her muscles screamed. Her lungs burned. She fell backward twice, pulling Tom down with her, the snow trying to swallow them both. Every time she looked at the amber glow of her living room window, it seemed to be retreating a mirage in a frozen desert. 10 feet. She was dragging him by his armpits, now walking backward. Her own hands and feet were completely numb. 5 feet. The front door suddenly burst open. Mark Miller and Greg Walsh spilled out onto the porch fighting the snow. They had defied her orders. They had opened the door. "Grab him!" Leah screamed. The two men waded into the drift, seizing Tom's legs and heavy coat. Together, the three of them heaved his unconscious body up the steps and over the threshold, collapsing onto the entryway floor in a tangled heap of limbs and snow. Brenda and Nancy immediately rushed forward, hauling the heavy wool blankets back over the doorframe to seal the house. The sudden rush of 50-degree air in the living room felt like stepping into an oven compared to the void outside. Leah rolled over, gasping for breath, her chest heaving violently. "He's not moving," Greg said, his voice trembling with terror as he hovered over Tom. "Leah, he's not breathing right." Leah forced herself up on her frozen hands and knees. "Get his coat off! Cut it if you have to! Get those wet boots off him!" The living room sprang into frantic, coordinated action. The neighborhood dynamics were completely obliterated. There were no association presidents, no gossips, no social climbers. There were just terrified humans fighting for the life of one of their own. Mark used a kitchen knife to slice through the heavy zippers of Tom's frozen parka, peeling the stiff material away. They stripped him down to his base layers. His skin was ice cold to the touch. "We can't rub his hands or feet," Leah ordered, remembering her grandfather's survival lessons. "The skin is freezing. If we rub it, the ice crystals in his blood will shred his tissue. We have to warm his core." Greg, Mark lay on either side of him. "Share your body heat. Brenda, get the hot water bottles from my bed. put them in his armpits, on his chest, and his groin. For the next 2 hours, the house descended into an agonizing, tense vigil. Leah sat near Tom's head, monitoring his shallow, erratic breathing. She wrapped his rigid violet hands gently in dry, room-temperature towels, praying that the tissue damage wasn't irreversible. In the corner, Leo watched with wide eyes. He clutched his stuffed bear, completely silent. He knew with the acute intuition of a child that the man on the floor had gone out into the monster for him. Finally, just past midnight, a violent tremor racked Tom's body. He gasped a harsh, ragged sound, and his eyes fluttered open. He began to shiver violently, his teeth clicking together with alarming force. The shivering was a brutal, painful process, but it was the greatest thing Leah had ever seen. It meant his body was fighting back. His central nervous system was coming back online. What? Tom stammered, his eyes darting wildly around the dim, lantern-lit room, unable to focus. "You're inside, Tom," Leah said softly, leaning over him, tears finally spilling down her cheeks. "You're in the house. The fan is running. You did it." Tom looked up at her. His arrogant, polished veneer was completely gone, replaced by raw, unvarnished vulnerability. He looked at his hands wrapped in the towels and winced in agony as the blood slowly, painfully began to flow back into his extremities. "Leo." Tom forced the word out, his voice a raspy whisper. He's right here," Leah said, motioning for her son. Leo crept forward, dragging his sleeping bag. He kneeled next to Tom's head. The little boy reached out and gently patted Tom's shoulder. "Thank you for fixing the breathing pipes, Mr. Tom." Tom closed his eyes, a single tear escaping and tracking down his cheek. "You're welcome, buddy," he whispered. "You're welcome." The storm raged for another 36 hours, an unrelenting siege of wind and ice. But inside the Jenkins house, a profound shift had occurred. The petty grievances and superficial judgments of Oak Creek had been frozen out, leaving behind a deep forged-in-fire camaraderie. They pooled their resources. Greg admitted he had a stash of high-calorie protein bars in his hunting jacket pockets, which he sheepishly handed over to Leah for rationing. Nancy, who had been catatonic with shock, slowly emerged from her shell, taking over the task of entertaining Leo so Leah could rest. Tom's recovery was agonizing. As his core temperature stabilized, the pain of the frost nip in his hands and feet became excruciating. Leah treated him with the careful, measured application of lukewarm water and ibuprofen from her first aid kit. His fingers blistered horribly, the skin turning a mottled, terrifying red and black, but the capillary refill slowly returned. He wouldn't lose his fingers, but the scars would be permanent. On the morning of day 5, the silence woke them. It wasn't the dead, terrifying silence of a blocked vent. It was the absence of the wind. Leah sat up from the floor. The heavy plastic sheeting over the windows was glowing with a brilliant, blinding light. "The sun," Mark whispered from his corner. Leah moved to the window and peeled back a corner of the duct tape. She pulled a sliver of the thick plastic down and looked out. The sky was a piercing, cloudless, violently bright blue. The world outside was completely unrecognizable. The snow had buried the first floors of nearly every house on Maple Drive. Cars were nothing but gentle white mounds. The ancient oak trees were stripped bare, their branches encased in thick sheaths of glittering ice. But it was over. The bomb cyclone had passed. At 11 a.m., the ground began to vibrate. It was a deep, rhythmic thrumming that shook the floorboards. "Listen," Greg said, standing up sharply. From down the street, the massive mechanical roar of heavy diesel engines echoed through the frozen air. 2 massive National Guard front-end loaders, followed by a convoy of utility trucks and an ambulance, were brutally carving their way through the 6-foot drifts, creating a canyon of snow down the center of Maple Drive. They were saved. When the front-end loader finally cleared the drift blocking Leah's front yard, a team of paramedics waded up to her door. When Leah pulled the door open, the lead medic, bundled in heavy Arctic gear, practically fell backward. "Fee! Holy hell!" the medic gasped, feeling the wave of 50-degree air hit his face. He looked at the 7 people inside, all relatively healthy sipping hot water. We've been pulling bodies and half-frozen people out of mansions all morning. How in God's name do you have heat? You don't have a generator running. Earth-coupled heat exchange. Tom Garrison croaked from his spot on the couch, holding up his bandaged hands with a weak, proud smile. She built a geothermal loop. She saved us all. The evacuation was chaotic. The utility grid was utterly destroyed. Power wouldn't be restored to Oak Creek for another 3 weeks. The neighborhood was declared a disaster zone. Before the National Guard escorted them to the warming shelter set up in the city center, Tom, Greg, and Mark asked to check their homes. Leah accompanied Tom across the street, walking through the deep trench carved by the loaders. When Tom opened the heavy custom oak door of his towering modern craftsman, the devastation was absolute. The house was an ice cave. The temperature inside was 10 degrees. Because the power had failed, the state-of-the-art oil furnace had died. With no heat, the water inside the massive plumbing network of the 5-bathroom house had frozen solid. The expansion of the ice had violently burst dozens of pipes inside the walls. When the sun had briefly hit the roof that morning, warming the attic, some of that ice had melted, sending thousands of gallons of water cascading through the ceilings. The water had then refrozen as it hit the freezing interior air. Tom's custom hardwood floors were buckled and destroyed. His imported Italian leather furniture was encased in a thick glaze of solid ice. The drywall was ruined, sagged, and split. The sheer financial cost of the damage was easily in the hundreds of thousands of dollars. Greg's house had fared worse. The deep freeze had caused the saturated ground around his foundation to heave, cracking the concrete basement walls and compromising the structural integrity of the entire home. Tom stood in his ruined, frozen living room, his breath pluming in the air. He looked at the shattered remains of his wealth. Then, he turned to look out his window across the street to Leah's small, aging, intact ranch house. He didn't cry for his house. He just laughed. It was a rich, genuine laugh of pure disbelief and profound realization. 5,000 square feet of garbage, Tom muttered, shaking his head. He looked at Leah. You were the richest person on this street, Leah. We were just too blind to see it. 6 months later, the bitter memory of the polar vortex had given way to a vibrant, unseasonably warm May. Oak Creek was a town in the midst of massive reconstruction. Everywhere you looked, there were contracting vans, dumpsters, and the constant sound of circular saws. Nearly 80% of the homes had required total internal gut jobs due to water damage from burst pipes. Leah's house, however, remained untouched by the destruction. Her front yard, once the site of the infamous mud pie project and the agonizing trench where Tom had almost lost his life, was now covered in lush, thick green grass. There was no sign of the massive black corrugated pipes buried 4 feet below, quietly waiting to pull the cool 52-degree earth air up during the blistering summer heat, doubling as a passive air conditioning system. On a bright Tuesday morning, a familiar white Ford F-150 pulled up to her curb. Daniel Caldwell, the city code enforcement inspector, stepped out. He wasn't wearing his stern scowl this time. He was accompanied by 2 men in business suits holding clipboards. Leah was on her porch drinking iced tea with Tom Garrison. Tom's hands had healed, though the skin on his fingers was permanently scarred, pale and sensitive to the cold. It was a badge of honor he wore proudly. He had moved out of his massive empty house across the street, which was currently on the market as a total renovation project, and rented a modest townhouse downtown, though he spent most of his mornings sitting on Leah's porch. Morning, Leah. Tom. Daniel called out, walking up the path. Here to find me for the grass being too green. Daniel. Leah teased gently. Daniel laughed, shaking his head. No fines today. Leah, I'd like you to meet the head structural engineer for the county and the director of the State Energy Commission. The 2 men stepped forward, shaking Leah's hand with deep respect. Ms. Jenkins, the energy director said. Daniel filed a report on your property after the blizzard. We've spent the last 3 months analyzing the schematics you provided him, the resilience of your passive earth tube system during a total grid failure. It's unprecedented for a residential retrofit in this soil type. We're drafting new residential building codes for the state of Michigan. The structural engineer added, "We want to incentivize and subsidize the installation of emergency passive geothermal loops in all new housing developments. We're calling it the Jenkins Protocol. We'd like to hire you as a civilian consultant for the planning committee." Leah was stunned. She looked at Tom, who was beaming with immense pride. I don't have an engineering degree," Leah stammered. "I just read my grandfather's old notebooks and watched videos." "You kept your house 50 degrees above the ambient lethal temperature using a car battery and dirt," Daniel said firmly. "You know more about practical application than anyone in a classroom. Say yes, Leah." "Say yes," Tom echoed, nudging her shoulder. "Yes," Leah smiled. "Absolutely." After the city officials left, leaving behind a stack of lucrative consulting contracts, Leah leaned back in her chair. The crippling financial anxiety that had defined her life for the past 3 years was completely gone. Not just because of the new job offer, but because of what had happened in March. She had gone to the bank to request a forbearance on her mortgage to pay for some summer repairs. The bank manager had looked at her with utter confusion, turned his screen around, and showed her a balance of exactly $0. An anonymous wire transfer from a private trust had paid off the remaining $180,000 on her home. She had confronted Tom immediately. He had denied it, of course. He claimed he didn't know what she was talking about. But the slight knowing smirk on his face the first time she had seen that smirk since the blackout gave him away entirely. He couldn't buy his way out of the storm, but he could use his wealth to give the woman who saved his life the ultimate freedom. "You know Greg is installing a system in his new yard next week," Tom said, taking a sip of his tea, looking out at the neighborhood. "He called me this morning asking how deep the trench needs to be." "Did you tell him 4 feet?" Leah asked. "I told him 6, Tom laughed. "Let him dig, builds character." Leah chuckled, watching Leo run across the green lawn chasing a butterfly. His asthma had improved dramatically over the spring, the clean filtered air from the earth tubes providing a pure, steady environment in the house. The affluent suburb of Oak Creek had learned a brutal, permanent lesson about the fragility of modern luxury. They had learned that when the grid fails and the screens go dark, all the money in the world cannot buy warmth. True survival didn't come from a smart thermostat or an imported marble foyer. It came from the earth beneath their feet, the ingenuity of a desperate mother, and the profound, unbreakable warmth of human connection when the world goes cold. The incredible survival story of Leah Jenkins proves that true wealth isn't what you have in your bank account. It's the knowledge in your head and the courage in your heart. When the world froze over a mother's love and a brilliant, forgotten piece of science outsmarted a multi-million-dollar neighborhood. If Leah's genius earth tube system and Tom's ultimate redemption arc inspired you, don't let this story stop here. Hit that like button to show your support for this amazing single mom. Share this video with your friends, family, and anyone who loves an incredible true story of survival and human connection. You never know who might need to learn about off-grid heating, and make sure you subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss another jaw-dropping real-life story. Let us know in the comments, would you have the strength to dig those trenches? See you in the next video.